Hello folks, I'm Pamela Young. This is Thrive 2030 brought to you by GrowthCurv. And today my guest is founder and chief executive of Pollination Climate Change Advisory and Investment Firm based in Sydney, working a lot across Asia Pacific, but also in both North America and Europe. And we'll hear about that shortly. Hello, how are you, Martijn?
Very well, thanks. Nice to see you.
And you too. Thanks so much for giving us time today. You have had a smoking hot 4.5 years since you established your firm. Before that, you were the head of the Climate Law and Finance Division, global head for Baker McKenzie. So you were in climate law for 20 years before starting your own business, isn't that right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, and I think you're also at the moment chair of the Australian Government's National Reconstruction Foundation
National Reconstruction Fund.
National Reconstruction Fund, managing a $15 billion fund, which is quite a responsibility. And you're also chair of the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership in Vienna. So I think prior to that, you've also sat on quite a number of other boards over many years on helping the world get to understand sustainability and climate change issues. So it's really great to have this opportunity to talk with you, someone with a 25-year career in this sector. So can we start with the big picture? If you look back over the 25 years, what has the journey been like? I know it must have been exciting because it's a new area, but it must have had its peaks and troughs like any other sector. Can you just give us a broad overview of what the journey's been like being at the forefront of the whole climate change movement?
Yeah, so I think one of the really important things about climate change is that what drives climate change and the response to climate change is the science. And we go back to 1992, which is when, in effect, the United Nations Permanent Convention on Climate Change was first came into force. That was a global international treaty that was really set up to get governments around the world to start thinking about and committing to reducing emissions. And that's, when you think about it today, that is a long time ago. And that was in 1992. The scientists continued to meet to refine the science. And there was a lot of talk about, well, what is this climate change? It's happening. The momentum's going forward on the science. But a lot of people still simply didn't believe it was true, or just thought it was just something they were thinking about, but it wasn't really a cause for concern. I think as we've moved through the last 25, 30 years, obviously the science has become clearer and clearer and clearer, resulting in the Paris Agreement, where there was a commitment to maintain emissions at no greater than resulting in a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. But there has been an increasing body of science to underpin that. Now, one would think that with that science, there would be very much a global response to that, the need to curb emissions, the need to manage what goes on. But the policy response has been very up and down, and there's been many highs and lows. And I think at an international level, there has certainly been growing momentum. We've gone from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to the Kyoto Protocol, which set in 2007, which set other targets, through to the Paris Agreement, which sets even more stringent targets for reducing emissions. But that's at a global level, and that really relies on governments and companies to reduce emissions. And so at the country level, we've had all sorts of variances about some countries who commit to this action and some who don't. And, in Australia alone, we've had a period of, incredible, probably Australia's been, with the US, the most volatile political systems in terms of dealing with climate. With Australia, we've had legislation come in to cap emissions trading schemes come in, then get over-appealed by the Abbott government. Then we now have legislation back in. And so it's been a bit of a roller coaster in Australia, although interestingly, Australian companies have been quite responsive to that and have understood the issue. But, when Trump was elected, for example, he repealed America's commitment to the Paris Agreement. So you see this sort of come and going of policy action towards climate, and it just hasn't necessarily moved fast enough. When I was a young lawyer and joined Baker McKenzie back in 1999, one of the first meetings I had was with a large energy company in Queensland, who said to me, well, what do you want to talk about? I said, climate change. There's no such thing as climate change. What else would you like to talk about? So, there's still, during the course of my career, I've had to deal with deniers. People are still today saying it's not happening. And there's a whole collective, I guess, group of people who work very hard to really develop very good policy and responses and corporate action towards climate change, and also just understanding that this is also an economic transition and really working. And at the moment in Australia, we're seeing the government very much focused on this whole agenda as an economic transition and the need for governments to invest public money to help with that transition.
Yes. Now, you mentioned the Paris Agreement, which was 2015. And I recall in the early 2000s, there was global debates and they were endless about whether or not it was a real thing. And I do recall the scientists doing endless studies and putting out endless reports to try and prove the point. So when they got to 2015, that agreement obviously put some of that argument to bed, didn't it? And it's kind of behind us. I get a feeling that since 2015 and up till now, there is less denial, although, as you say, there are still people who are in denial, so some countries that don't take heed of the science and the Paris Agreement. Do you think that we've come a little bit of ways since 2015? Do you think there's a movement now to try and get things on track?
Yeah, there definitely is, but it's still, I would say, piecemeal. So at one level, you take Australia as an example. The government has made a very strong commitment to reduce emissions. Most of our states have net zero by 2050 targets, or very aggressive targets to get even bigger, quite big reductions by 2030, 2035. So at a federal and state level in Australia, we have very strong commitments. But the commitments is one thing. You really need strong policy and action to drive change. And so one of the challenges that, despite the commitments in the Paris Agreement, despite the commitments of many governments and many corporates who have very aggressive emission reduction plans to be net zero by 2050, we don't actually have, in many cases, the action or the policy mechanisms or the tools to make sure that actually happens. So for me, what is concerning is that, there are a group of people whom, yes, they're committing to these long-term targets, but they don't actually have a pathway how to get there. And the other problem is we also have parts of the economy which believe that, we're still going to rely on strong fossil fuels for another 20, 30 years and are still going out exploring for new fossil fuels, when really our focus has got to be on how do we finance and accelerate the solutions that are the alternatives to the existing ways of economic activity that contribute to climate change.
So on that policy point, which countries are the early adopters? Which countries are leading the charge in that regard?
Well, so very early on, Europe led the charge. They had a European-wide emissions trading scheme, and they were very aggressive on that. Then we had other countries that, at the state level, like in California, New South Wales, that adopted their own emissions trading schemes. And these schemes all were designed to bring emissions down. And that's a regulatory measure that actually caps emissions and forces polluters to reduce their emissions and allows them to have permits. New Zealand, the same. But what we're seeing now is, while those schemes are still in most of those countries in place, we're seeing two things happen. We're seeing many developing countries develop emissions trading and carbon offset programs to try to reduce emissions at level, and we're seeing a significant amount of public finance being pushed into financing economic activity that reduces emissions. And interestingly, that is not just a case of, Australia, the US with the IRA, also Europe, Japan, all of whom are allocating large amounts of public capital. But when you look at what's happening in China, they're really building an entire decarbonisation manufacturing sector around solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles. India moving very fast on renewables. It's not, in many ways, these countries are actually technologically moving. China is probably the furthest ahead on producing and manufacturing a lot of those technologies that we need for the future. And so it's not just, it is a global phenomenon, but then there are other countries that are still very focused on producing fossil fuels. And so the real dilemma at the moment is the speed of the action. And so while there is action to do this, it just simply isn't moving fast enough.
How do we get it to quicken?
So I think one of the key ways is what the US has done with the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act and other finance measures. What Australia is doing with the Net Zero Transition Authority, with the National Reconstruction Fund, the CEFC, all of these are large-scale public measures that are there to fund and de-risk this transition. So if you do
Could you just expand on the Transition Authority, the Net Zero Transition Authority? What's their mandate? What are they there to do?
So in the Australian case, there's recognition that if we want to transition our economy away from solely reliant on fossil fuels and agriculture, we need to diversify the economic mix. There are also very strong areas in Australia like Gladstone, like Latrobe, like the Hunter Valley that have been economic powerhouses of the country. And there's a recognition that we need to plan carefully for how we transition those to a new economic future. And so the role of the Net Zero Transition Authority is to play a coordinating role in taking those regions and really reindustrializing them into a more decarbonised industrial zones, where there's, manufacturing, there may be green steel, there may be green hydrogen, battery manufacturing, etc. And so we are really trying to, the authority's role is to play a coordinating role in making that happen. So that's what it's intended to do.
Big responsibility.
Very big.
Can you see the benefits of that investment already or not yet?
Well, it's only just been set up and legislation's just been passed. But I think the point I would make on all of this, whether it's with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US or what's happening in Australia, is that there's a recognition that if we want to substantially change the economy, that comes with it a lot of economic. It's a lot of economic change. There is risk associated with that. Certain new technologies may or may not work, and therefore it does require a very well-resourced and a very well-resourced and a well de-risked strategy to do that. Having said that, that's not an excuse for inaction, because the fact is we're already significantly decarbonising our energy sector in Australia. We're shutting down coal power stations, we're putting in large batteries, we're focusing on solar panels and wind zones. There's a huge amount of activities going on, but to keep that momentum going and to go to the next level, there are challenges that happen with that in terms of how you control intermittent energy supply, how you get enough transmission lines across the country to move new power sources around. All that has to be managed. And to manage that, you do need governments to support that, underwrite that, de-risk that, but working very closely with investors there's a huge amount of capital that wants to invest in that transition.
So what about industries? If you look globally, we know that there is an issue with energy and energy companies and looking for alternative fuels. We also know that Tesla had put on, everybody's radar the need to move to electric vehicles, and other vehicle manufacturers are, coming to the fore and providing some competition. What about airlines and shipping companies and logistics companies? I mean, are they making progress?
Yeah, so one of the biggest, obviously, aviation contributes an enormous amount to global emissions, but the aviation sector is focused on how you decrease that, and the main measure that they are using is changing fuel. So changing from existing fuel sources to sustainable aviation fuel, which is basically fuel that comes either from ethanol or from crops, biofuels that is not a fossil fuel. And so the move to those clean fuels, and in some use cases there will be room for electric planes and hydrogen planes, and there is technologies emerging to get those into the mix at the moment, but the predominant focus is on sustainable aviation fuel. So what we're seeing at the moment is a huge amount of government support in the US for that. There's a number of companies that have produced technologies that produce sustainable aviation fuel. There are a number of different feedstocks that can be used for that. And so there's an enormous opportunity for someone like Australia, who has lots of land, lots of sun, lots of water, to grow the feedstock that will produce sustainable aviation fuel, and then have those companies that can produce that fuel set up in Australia and then distribute that fuel. At the moment, if an Australian airline wants to access sustainable aviation fuel, it largely comes from Singapore or from the US. We have an opportunity in Australia to build a significant industry around that, and to basically, be a major supplier of global demand.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the sort of innovator in me, the entrepreneur in me, gets kind of excited with all these new technologies. What you describe in Australia with the authority is a huge expectation on them and industry to make enormous changes. So it does, on the other hand, sound exhausting. So on the one hand, it's exciting. On the other hand, it's exhausting. But it's a journey that we have to take, isn't it? So how do you sort of balance out the sort of, the exhaustion part of it with the excitement part of it? Because when I hear stories about electric taxis that are about to take off in America, the British government have made a commitment to introduce electric flying taxis, not electric, but flying electric taxis by 2026. Dubai have signed up to introduce flying, taxis as well. This all sounds really exciting, but there is the other stuff that's quite hard work in those heavy industries. Where do you think is the balance? And, what's your advice to people that are looking at both, those two ends of the spectrum? And what would you say to them about how to just breathe and take the journey? What's your sort of direction for them?
I think, first of all, it's painting a vision of what's possible, and it's believing in that. And so, if you think, certainly when you and I were at school, there were no mobile phones.
No.
I had no email. I had no computers.
Yeah.
Today, you could not imagine a world where that did not exist, right?
Yeah.
So the leaps in technology are incredible. And in our lifetime, what we see is amazing. And so doing a lot of this stuff is not as difficult as people would portray. And so you can make green iron and green steel. You just need renewable energy to do that. In Sweden, where they have large amounts of hydro, that enables them to produce that at scale. We can do that in Australia. You just need to decide that it's something that we want to do. And there are also, I would call them, pain points at which this becomes a lot easier. So it's far easier to talk about shutting down a coal power station when it's at the end of its life and you have no choice. And then you need to start thinking of alternatives. So if you shut down a coal power station and you find alternative energy, the thought is then, well, let's think about what is the alternative and perhaps cheaper way of doing this. When you look at that, actually, it's renewables, it's solar panels, it's wind, it's batteries, it's a mix of renewable energy, or it might be hydrogen or something else. But when you are forced to think of an alternative, you think of it, then it's really important to prove it can be done. So you may recall that in South Australia, when Elon Musk and Cannon Brooks did the large-scale battery, everybody said, will never work, will be totally defunct, will never be used, and will never make money. Well, within a very small amount of time, it was key to the system, it worked, it made money, and it led the way for many other people to build batteries in Australia. So now we have the rollout of many, many batteries in Australia, and that technology is proven. Now, if you look at another problem we have, which is data centers and AI and the amount of energy that they are going to use, it is phenomenal. So again, how do you incorporate the lessons that we have from big batteries, from large-scale solar, to incorporate and to support that sort of challenge that we have? So we had one challenge, and the shutdown of coal power fire stations, and we found solutions in the renewable space. We now have another problem with high energy use, but we have the ability to put those renewable solutions to work. So it's a constant learning and evolution, but we've got to basically try. We have to be not afraid to fail. So if we do something and the technology doesn't work, it doesn't mean it was a bad idea to try. We have to keep going.
Can we just turn our minds now to your wonderful career at Baker McKenzie as the head of climate and finance? What made you give up that 20-year career as a lawyer and start Pollination? And describe to us what Pollination does for its clients.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I had been a lawyer I've been a partner at Baker McKenzie for almost 20 years and built from scratch that climate and law practice. And we did some phenomenal work there with governments and with clients, and a lot of that was evolving the whole legal frameworks around the world on climate change. And it was very exciting. It was great.
Exciting, yeah.
Yeah, but towards the end, we were starting to see more and more investment in the climate space. And I was starting to see more clients coming to us saying, I've got a good idea. I need you to help me find some investors, maybe develop this business plan, help me with X, Y, Z. And if you do all of that, you can get some legal work. And I thought, well, you know what? A lot of the work I'm doing is not legal anymore. It's actually more investment banking. And so I was quite keen to see if we could build a business that would be a bit more of a player, so to speak, in the broader sense of being able to invest and being able to do advice and being able to create new opportunities. So it was really a desire to do that. So that's what led to the founding of Pollination. I did that with my co-founder, Tony O'Sullivan. Together, we founded the firm. He came from an investment bank background and was also, I understood quite a bit of this. And bringing that skill set together was enabled us to do that along with a team of other people at the very beginning. And so I think the driver was really, you saw some investment banks and starting to get into the renewable space, and Macquarie did that. You saw others, trying to get to set up funds in that space, but still very early. So we thought we could set up a multidisciplinary firm that provided solutions to the climate change space, both from an advisory perspective, an investment perspective, a project development perspective, and could bring that all together and be quite innovative, but with a core focus on the decarbonisation climate space. So that's what led us to do that. It's been developed now over the last 4 years, 4.5 years, I should say. We're still in that growth phase, but the need for what we do has not in any way declined, and if anything, has probably accelerated.
So I think what you do is you start out with a sort of a risk analysis around the impact that the business is having on climate and on nature, and then go through an advisory phase to help them understand what their plan needs to be to decarbonise or become more nature friendly, and then if they want to invest in projects, help them with that funding.
Yeah, so that's one example on the advisory, and our advisory business is much more than just giving advice. So we actually, I would describe it as we provide a solution. So if a client decides that they do want to transition or they want to reduce their emissions, we don't just sort of say, well, you've got an exposure to climate risk and therefore you need to think about it. We say, your directors have an obligation, you have an exposure, this is how we can help you fix it, and then we might develop a solution for them jointly to help them address the problem that they have. So it's far more than just, I would say, so it's far more than just giving some advice. It is that, what's very and very implementation focused.
Yes.
But the three parts of the business are, although they work together, they are also separate. So we do also manage third-party money through our funds business to help clients invest in broader solutions and get a return on investment. So many investors who have a high exposure, for example, to fossil fuels or to the building sector or transport or toll roads, a lot of them want to diversify their book. And so our investments platform provides an opportunity to invest in natural capital or in climate technology or in regenerative agriculture, wherever it may sit in our platform, and investors can invest in that and get an economic return that is linked with helping decarbonise, as opposed to an economic return that's linked to fossil fuels or toll roads, for example.
I know that boards and chief executives are all very conscious of their need to have a sustainability plan and be in action. For those who are listening today, what would you say is the bare minimum that they should have achieved by now?
Well, I think they needed a bare minimum to really understand what their directors' legal obligations are towards understanding the risk that climate and nature present to their business. And it's not just a fleeting sort of assessment. I mean, you now have significant obligations to understand that risk, to manage that risk, to work through that and take action against that risk to reduce it. You also have significant obligations around disclosure, and you need to disclose where you are on this journey and what you're doing to address it. You also have significant obligations not to greenwash and to basically be very honest with where you're at and not misrepresent the situation. And there's been, the ACCC is very active and aggressive at the moment in making sure that people don't mislead people on their plans. And so if you do have a plan, it needs to also be viable and work. And then it's also a question of just, we've had the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure. We now have a very big focus on nature as well. And for company directors to understand to what extent is their business, does it have a dependency on nature, or does it create a significant risk or damage to nature through its business? And I think, this is a new area that is emerging very fast, but a lot of the work we've done with clients is about understanding those supply chain risks and exposure from in the nature space as well as the climate space.
So for those who think that they've already done that, perhaps they might have done it well or not. You don't really know until you get to the stage of a catastrophe. You talked quite a bit about risk, and I'm wondering, of those who think that they have done the job, if you go back 3 years when I first started these interviews, I asked everybody in 21 and early 22, did they have a pandemic on their risk radar? And they said, yeah, some of them said yes, they did, but it was considered to be low risk.
Yeah.
I wonder how many people have got climate on their risk radar and still consider it to be low risk, and whether they're going to get bitten in the backside like everybody did with the pandemic because they didn't take it seriously.
Yeah, look, a lot of companies do take it seriously. A lot of fund managers take it and superannuation funds are taking it very seriously, but corporates perhaps not so much. I mean, it also depends on the level of which you do that risk assessment and how deep you go. And it also depends on your business. So some businesses have very, very high scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Others have no direct emissions and it's all scope 3. So it really depends on the nature of your business and what you're doing and the impact that you have. So obviously, a professional services firm is going to have a lot less impact than a global mining company. So it really does very much depend on what you do.
Are you able to share a case with us of an organisation or two that you have taken through a journey where you might have helped them to open their eyes to something that they hadn't anticipated and what that journey looked like, how you helped them?
Yeah, and I would say that a lot of the clients we do work with are quite leading in this space, but I'll give you one example close to home, which was Blackmores. Okay. So Blackmores obviously...
Just explain who Blackmores is for people outside of Australia.
Oh, sure. So Blackmores is a company that basically provides a lot of vitamins and health products, has quite a wide range of that, and they're very well known for that. They took a very strong leadership position to address the nature, to address nature as an area of concern for them. And why is that the case? It's the case because many of their products have a direct link to the natural environment. Many of their products and the inputs into their vitamins come from remote areas, rainforests and the like, and so they're quite and also from a lot of agricultural areas and elsewhere. So they have a whole supply chain that's very nature dependent. And so they went deep into their supply chain. We helped them look at a few products to understand what was the impact in that supply chain. If for example, there was a biodiversity if biodiversity was a crisis, or for example, if there was a major climate event that destroyed large areas, where else? Well, so firstly, does that product line simply go off? Secondly, where do they then get that product from if it's no longer available? And what is the impact on their revenue streams? So all of that, is quite important. And it's not that dissimilar what you mentioned, the pandemic. If you are getting a supply of part of your inputs to the main products that you sell, and suddenly they're no longer available, and you have to get alternatives that are 3 times the price. What does that do to your product line? Do you actually just shut it down, or what does that do to your overall revenue? So understanding both your dependency, in the Blackmores case, their dependency on nature and on the inputs they get to create the products they sell was really important, and understanding, also to the extent that they have an impact on nature, understanding what those risks are. So that was one example of something that we did.
How do they influence downstream suppliers or downstream people in the value chain who they might not have any control over? How do they
well, for all these companies, that this is an important issue, right? And you see this particularly in the agriculture sector with the large supermarkets going down the chain, where they often, I think in those cases, there's often the question, the supermarket chains wants all their suppliers to be carbon neutral or to have reduced emissions. That is quite expensive. It's often hard for them to actually measure their emissions because they don't do that because they're small family suppliers. And so part of that is an education process, and it's working in partnership to do that. What we often hear people say is, oh, well, we don't want to do that because it costs so much, increase the cost of production. But by providing the tools to do that and working collaboratively, that can be done. So part of it is, firstly, just a company like Blackmores is actually knowing where your entire supply chain is and comes from. And that's a really important issue. And so being able to, many companies actually just don't know where things come from. They don't know where the source is. They might get aluminium out of China, or they might get steel out of somewhere else. They might get an input out of another country, but they haven't actually done the full value chain sourcing and actually worked that out. So part of the journey Blackmores went on is to actually do that and then work closely with suppliers to understand what those risks were and how to manage them. And, we see a lot of corporates who are on top of this are very much trying to work with their suppliers for solutions. And quite often, to be honest with you, if ultimately a supplier does not want to work with you, they change suppliers.
For those people who never leave the city, and there are many of them, well, they might go from one city to the next. They might, leave Sydney and go to London for a holiday. And for the people who are not familiar with nature, have little interest in nature, very rarely take trips to jungles and places where they will see nature. You made a comment the other day about the sort of conflict between climate change and nature loss. And I thought just that tiny little phrase, nature loss, makes you start to think about what's happening here. Can you just, for those people who never leave a city, could you help them understand what the nature loss really looks like and how that might get pretty much worse over the next decade or two?
So the first thing I'd say is you don't have to leave a city to understand climate and the impacts on nature. We've seen recently in Greece, and the dust storms that have come from the Sahara as a result of changing weather patterns. We've seen historically in Singapore the smoke from the forest fires in Indonesia. We saw in New York last year, all of New York was blanketed in smoke. We've had times in Sydney where Sydney's been blanketed in smoke from bushfire burn-off. So you don't actually need to leave cities to understand that the air that you breathe, which is fundamental to life and fundamental to nature, can easily be contaminated, and what that does to sinuses and eye infections and people with asthma and breathing, it's terrible. You also don't need to leave the city to see if a harbour is full of plastic or is full of oil runoff, or after the terrible rains that we have, how dirty it is, right? So you can very easily see that how quickly nature can be impacted by events. And I think that's one thing to bear in mind. But in terms of species loss, there are many of us who, part of it is opening your eyes. In the city, you walk around, you hear a lot of birds, you see trees. But if you suddenly live in a landscape that is completely devoid of trees, or animals or bird sounds, again, that's something that you can see. I know a story that a friend of mine was telling me the other day how when he was young and he used to drive from Sydney to the Blue Mountains, the windscreen would be covered in crickets and insects in summer, and now it's just none. So if you're observant, you can see that loss. But at the same time, in terms of what's happening more broadly, you only need to look at some of the maps of the loss of the Amazon over the last 20 years and how much that has shrunk. That has huge impact. So the loss of the Amazon has a huge impact on decreasing global rainfall patterns, which then has an impact on US agriculture, because those rain patterns that used to go more frequently to the US do not go there anymore. And so then agriculture starts to get affected. So I think, living in the city, it's not a reason that you don't need to, you don't acknowledge this, but I think, the amount of, one of the challenges that we're facing rapidly is a massive decline in biodiversity, a lot of the loss of certain species are becoming extinct. And yes, sitting in the city, you probably just don't notice that, but it will have a fundamental impact on the ecosystem increasingly, and that's a real issue.
Okay, so now let's look a little bit, to the future, and sort of have a bit of conversation now about what needs to happen in the next decade to bring on the speed of people's commitment and the change, and get everybody delivering what we came out of the Paris Agreement in 2015. COP29 is in Azerbaijan in November. What do you think? What would you be advising them to achieve, as an outcome for that conference?
So I think one thing to remember about the COPs is they are about political momentum. They don't force, or they don't end in the result of national countries adopting action. Countries give commitments, so whether they actually go and do that, it's another issue.
Yes,
so I think, but having said that, the momentum is, so momentum is important, because the more momentum you get, the more signaling that sends.
Yes.
When the COPs are in fossil fuel countries like the Middle East and like Baikal, like in the city, it's in a country like Azerbaijan and Baikal, there's always a concern that there's too much focus on not moving forward, and there's too much focus on maintaining this fossil fuel status quo. there needs to be a recognition that we're not moving fast enough. There needs to be a recognition we need to move faster. There needs to be an ongoing commitment to dealing with loss and damage, which is the compensating developing countries. But to me, one of the most important things about the COP is just how do you help developing countries to really transition fast and forcing developed countries to continue to do that.
But so money wasn't a pot of money set aside at the last COP to help the developing countries?
The money that was set in the loss and damage fund is insignificant. It's just will have no impact. I mean, we spend more money on, building freeways in Australia by multiples and multiples and multiples, and it has been set aside for that.
Yes.
I mean, at the end of the day, we just need to basically ensure that we have a massive development of the alternative solutions that reduce emissions, and then we make sure that those are deployed to developing countries as well as developed countries. Yeah. To me, the future is really about government, global and national government intervention in building new economies and helping to avoid significant more investing in those parts of the global economy that increase emissions or that actually are detrimental to climate change and nature. And that's what we have to focus on.
So there have been quite a lot of youth groups attending the COP conferences. Do you think they are having a positive impact? Do you think they are able to drive momentum?
Yeah, I think youth groups are important because they are the future. They are the future, and they represent the people who are going to inherit the mess that we're making. They're also going to help us provide the solutions and develop the solutions and implement the solutions that we need. We have a responsibility to the youth to help them on that journey. And I think, recognising that for them it's not enough, it's not good enough where we are is really, really important. So look, I think everyone has an important role to play, and even the fossil fuel companies have an important role to play to the extent that those fossil fuel companies are currently providing the energy source, but the extent that they can play a key role in ceasing to produce and finding solutions to fossil fuels. So everybody should be encouraged to help us in this transition and finding a way to do that.
It's quite a challenge, isn't it, for the CEOs? I mean, post-COVID, they had a lot more to deal with than they had before COVID. Their digitisation projects were going to take 5 or 10 years, and all of a sudden with COVID, they had to speed those up and sort of truncate everything into 6 months. In addition to that, they had all the changes in their organisation with hybrid working and, the need to learn new skills about, trying to lead and manage people through a camera. And then, of course, they've got, the challenges that came along in early 2022, with the war and the cost of living and the prices and so forth. Which is, now exacerbated right around the world, challenges economically and fiscally, and cost of living is going through the roof and so forth. So what's happening is chief executives in the last 4 years have had a lot more to do. And that means their budgets have to be a lot more spread. And so as the board and the top team are looking at their businesses and looking at what they've got to project forward, and as you pointed out very rightly, the rate of change is exponential. So not only have they got a wider breadth of or scope of responsibilities with more things to look after, the pace of change is exponential, and they've got to make the budget go round. So it's really important that you get focus and you identify the things that are going to accelerate the most important things. What would your advice be to them who are sitting there thinking, crikey, how are we going to do this over the next 10 years? How are we going to get to, whatever their 2030 goals are? How do they balance all these competing demands? So
I think too often many companies think about the short term and not the longer term. And I think about climate as a cost when in fact it should be considered as an economic opportunity. So if you are a company that has high emissions and you want to find a way to reduce those emissions, and there are good technologies to do that, then how do you get access to those technologies? And in some cases, you may need government support. There's also government support out there to do that. And how do you actually start to transition? And particularly where adopting some new technology can actually save you a lot of money. So if you are, using high cost fossil fuels, but you can use lower cost renewable energy, then the investment having that amortize over a time period is very important to understand that. I think also for some companies who have a service that, quite frankly, will become stranded or no longer acceptable under the sort of desire to reduce emissions. What are the alternatives that they can expand into that will produce revenue streams? So, for example, if you do sell fossil fuel energy, how do you become a supplier of renewable energy? If you are a supplier of petrol, how do you become a supplier of sustainable aviation fuel? If you are a producer of diesel trucks, how do you become a supplier or builder of diesel trucks? How do you become a supplier of electric vehicles? And then how do you team up with people in the value chain and the infrastructure chain that actually provide what is critical infrastructure necessary to make that operate? So these changes are going to happen. There are going to be companies that are going to transition quite quickly. There are going to be others that will not and will end up like Kodak. And so those who have forward-thinking, understanding CEOs were the ones who succeed. And in many of these industries, there's a really interesting question. Will it be the incumbents who are able to flip, or will it be new market entrants who will dominate? And at the moment, two of the major, although many of the car companies are transitioning to electric vehicles, many of the dominant car companies like BYOD, like Tesla, are actually new companies, new market entrants that are actually building these products for the first time. So it's going to be interesting to see that some of those incumbents will not survive, but others will flip and will be successful.
Yeah, I think there'll be probably an equal number of those that won't survive, those that will be able to make the transition, and then the third sector will be the new entrants, as you point out. So it is important that they really take stock, isn't it, and have a good hard look at whether they can do the pivot or not. And I speak to people a lot about the hurdles and the things that get in the way of them thinking outside the box, which prohibits them from pivoting to doing something that's completely different than they think about themselves as doing it in the normal course of events. It takes a skill. Now, Martijn, what drives you in this? I mean, why environmental science? Why are you doing this work? What is the driver and the motivator for you?
I think, first of all, we have a massive global problem to address, and I think it's important that people who understand that problem and would hopefully have some skill set to be able to do it, engage in it and put their efforts towards it. And so I think I've always had a pretty strong commitment to doing what is right. And I think that, the fight against climate and particularly nature protection is absolutely critical to me. That's not to say there are many, many important issues on the table, whether it's violence against women, whether it's child poverty, whether it's healthcare. There are just so many issues that have to be dealt with at the moment. But I guess the area that I fell into and that I'm been working on my life is this area. I think also it's intellectually challenging, and the challenge that we have before us finding those solutions is really important. So to the extent that I can help a little bit, or we can help change the narrative a bit on why it's important to address climate change and to protect nature is fundamental. I think we also owe it to our future generations, our kids and their kids and grandkids, to leave the world in a better place than we came into it. And so trying to make sure that we do that's also really important. So I think, at the end of the day, and that is critical, but also I think finally there's an incredible opportunity to create a wonderful new economy that is, and there's also a huge amount of economic opportunity and economic prosperity. So if you want to maintain a standard of living that we currently have and continue to do things, we can actually have a new economic reality that returns a significant amount of economic prosperity without having to compromise on that. And so I think, understanding that, and with economic prosperity comes better healthcare, longer life, all that sort of stuff. And I think that's really important. So I think for me, it's not just one thing, but it's really trying to make a difference and trying to actually, come up with solutions that really work.
Yeah, it is a connected system, isn't it? As you say, there are costs and opportunity costs. And the more that we think about the quality of life and what we're leaving behind for the next generation, They're all connected, and the next generation are placing quite serious demands on leaders today. They have different expectations. They want to work in a different way. And of course, there'll be another generation behind them that will have even more radical expectations that we're not used to. So we do have to sort of get ready for a playing field that is going to look quite different, don't you think?
I think that's right. Absolutely.
Now, Martijn, the last question I ask everybody on these calls is, if your next role was chief executive of the world, what would you put on your top 100 list to address on your list to address in that first 100 days?
Oh, that's a big question. It's a very big question. I think in the first 100 days, you would think that you would know what the 5 or 10 top priorities are, and you would try to work out, I guess some people try to do this at the moment, but you would try to work out what those priorities are, what the major challenges are, what the major blockages are, how you unblock them, and how you start to move action towards them. But that's an impossible task. But I think, there are certain issues like climate change and nature, but also poverty, starvation, war. We're set in a very fragile global macroeconomic environment at the moment. And I think getting people together and working together is really important. I think one of the failures that we have is there's too much, I guess, people who see each other as the enemy and not as a cohesive global population that should be working together for the benefit of the planet and people. But you also have a certain problem with certain political leaders, and you may, maybe one of my 100 days is changing that political mix if you were the CEO of the world and if you had the ability to move the management team. There's certain countries where you would certainly be extracting those leaders.
Yeah, for sure. I think we talked the other day about there being a possible split in the world. Would that be one of the things you might try and address in your first 100 days?
Yeah, I think there is a split in the world at the moment, particularly economically, in those countries that want to drive very hard change on decarbonisation that don't. And so demonstrating what can be done and why it's good to be done is really, really important. But also trying to get global peace is very important in a time of when we don't have that global peace. And I think that's a major issue, really.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martijn. It's been a really interesting conversation. I think we've covered a lot of topics, and I look forward to watching your progress at Pollination. You have done amazingly well in those 4 years. I know that you have, in the last 6 to 12 months, acquired some enormous talent of people from quite a variety of different industries. So I wish you all the very best and hope that people reach out to you for support, because you're obviously doing a terrific job. So thanks for joining us today. All the best.
Thanks very much, Pamela. I very much appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome.